an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, welcome in. Final day, the ultimate day of May 2023. May 31st, it's a Wednesday. Welcome in. Dave Trafford here. It's Now and Next for Story Studio Network. Just a couple of things off the top. I know we've been talking about some of the programming that we're doing outside of podcasting. There were plans today to help those of you who are in the podcast world, give you some good guidance and advice on how to grow your show. And we had planned to do 90 minutes at noon Eastern time. We've canceled that, so if you haven't seen any of the notices and you signed up for it, we pulled the plug on it. Erin can smell the Halifax wildfires from her back porch, so we thought it was more important to sort of put that on hold, and we'll get back to it when we can. But there were other things certainly in her neck of the woods that are more pressing right now. So 150 odd homes lost and damaged, and I heard her on the radio this morning with John Moore. And to put it in context, it would be the areas that are burning look a lot like, I don't know, for those of you in Toronto, Don Mills. Leafy neighborhoods, not in the middle of the sticks. Lots of green. And, otherwise you wouldn't think of as being subject to the wildfires. So that's where they are in Halifax today. And the fire chief there telling us that it looks like there were 2 more fires started overnight. None of them is under control. And that's, needless to say, it sounds glib, but that's the nature of the wildfire, of course. So we're watching that with interest and some level of concern. For those of you asking, Aaron and Dan and the girls are out of harm's way, relatively speaking. But again, the nature of the fires, some of this thing happened pretty quickly, and the mandatory evacuation orders have been have gone out in a community called Bedford. So it's not very far from the core of Halifax or Dartmouth. So just fire it up on a map and you'll see how close all of this is. And it's extraordinary to think that this is going on in that part of the world. We hear about wildfires, California or British Columbia or Alberta. It's kind of unusual to hear about it in these areas of Atlantic Canada. So that'll be part of the discussion, no doubt, when we start to talk about climate goals and everything else, and it all sounds so abstract. Well, there are homes and families who've been burned out in various parts of this country, and we can point directly to the effects of climate change. So we'll watch that story with interest, etc., as we move forward. There are a few other things on the agenda, and the mayoralty race, of course, is continuing at whatever plodding pace here in Toronto. Another debate is expected tonight, so we've been keeping an ear and an eye on those. Who will be on the stage? Anthony Furey not invited to be on the stage, although some of the polling has put him in the top 5 or 6, so it's getting down to a bit of a crunch. And I think it's an interesting phenomenon where Anthony has not been able to get on the debate stage, but is making news because he's not making it onto the debate stage, given his appearance in the polls. And again, I go back to the polls only being about name recognition more than anything, as opposed to voting intention, because the idea that somehow you're going to have a poll that's valid. We talked to David Coletto about this yesterday. It's not really possible to do. Nonetheless, what are they talking about? And I thought there are a few things that are really kind of hitting the street. The folks at Daily Bread Food Bank were first out of the gates holding what I would consider the first formal debate. And we've chatted a lot about that. And the question was whether or not anything that's on this campaign is actually cutting through, breaking through. Are we hearing what we want to hear? Neil Hetherington's the CEO at Daily Bread. I want to talk to you about that and a couple of other things. But the headline for Anthony Furey today was about the the kits that were being handed out with the crack pipes, etc., with the Toronto City of Toronto bag, and it's harm reduction was the whole point of this. And he's making headlines, he's making noise, he's getting earned media as a result of it. But when you think about the commentary around it, it doesn't get to the point where we've got mental health, we've got homeless issues, we've got addiction issues. That flash in the pan headline may be effective politically for him, but I'm not hearing anybody who's actually come out and said, this is what our Toronto looks like. We're going to have to actually make moves to ensure that there are long-term plans in place to not solve them, but address them. And I don't think we talk a lot about this in terms of bumper sticker labels. And I don't know, there isn't a whole lot of there behind much of this discussion and debate on the campaign.
Well, good morning, Dave. It's nice to chat with you. Yeah, it certainly got headlines, and I think that it's a positive thing that the city wants to make sure from a harm reduction perspective that we are putting assets and resources there. At the same time, I think that harm reduction is masking a bigger problem, a number of hurting people in the city, and a lack of ability to move from detox to rehab, and just how difficult that is. I used to work with Dixon Hall, and I know that in our shelter system, when somebody went through, say, an overdose and made that decision to go to detox, they might have a day or two there and flush things out of the system, but not actually address the real harm. And they'd have to wait some 6 to 8, 10 months before they got into rehab. And you can imagine how difficult that gap would be. But again, does this not bring up like a broader issue in terms of the number of individuals who are in a situation where they feel a sense of hopelessness? Maybe it's because they don't have the housing that they have a right to. Maybe it's because their employment is not paying the bills, and there's a sense of stress and concern that the city is really feeling. Like there's a real sense of anxiety in our city right now, and I think that there are plausible paths forward, and I'm hopeful that the mayoral candidates have that discussion tonight and continue to put affordability and systemic causes and challenges up front and come with solutions.
Yeah, and this is the debate that's being sponsored, organized by United Way. Is that who's involved here?
I think it's tonight's United Way and Toronto Metropolitan
right.
University. And,
So I expect that a number of these issues will come up, considering the location of the university and where the public health office happens to be, right next door. It'll be a timely conversation. I want to talk to you about what's going on in Ottawa, because it seems to be more or less, kind of under the radar for a lot of folks. But I know it's probably on the front burner for you, and that was the Canada Disability Benefit Act. The formal name, I think, is actually, the Act to Reduce or Mitigate Poverty, which you and I have spent a lot of time talking about. But the idea here being that there would be a national program, a disability benefit, and it seemed to be on track. It got to the Senate. The Senate has spent 3 months looking at it, sent it back with amendments, and on the surface of it, I think the amendments make sense, and that is to say they want the benefit in place, but they don't want it to be a situation where provinces can claw back their benefits because the federal benefit sort of is filling a gap, that this should be a cumulative thing. Now there are lawyers who are coming out and saying, well, constitutionally you can't do that because you're limiting the powers of the provinces, you're handcuffing their legislative abilities. That kind of conversation, Neil, worries me, because all of a sudden I think here was a great idea, something that's on track, and it just might not happen. And I'm not being dismissive of the Constitution by any stretch of the imagination, but reasonably this makes sense. Whether it suits the the actual balance of powers or the division of powers between the feds and the province. That's where we get bogged down so often in this stuff.
Have hope, Dave. Have hope. There is absolute possibility for this to go through and get to its intended benefit and to the people in Canada that are desperate for it. The amendments that I testified at the Senate, and the senators were asking great questions, and I was really challenged. They would say, should it be amended to do this? Should it be amended to do that? And in each case, they were right. Yes, it actually did need to be amended because it was just a framework. There was no meat on the bones. But I was terrified that if they sent it back with massive amendments, that the House would dissolve at the end of June and that it would just sort of die. And so they did. They did send it back with amendments, and Frances Lincoln, Senator Lincoln, sort of put her arm around my shoulder and said, there. We do this all the time. It can go through quickly. Don't worry. Don't worry about this." Okay, so that's problem number one, was timing and feeling relatively comfortable that by June, the House of Commons should be able to agree to the amendments. The amendments all made sense. What they were it was not just about provinces cutting it back. It was, let's say you've got a job and you go on long-term disability. That private insurer says, we're going to make sure you get a certain amount of money for this long-term disability. And if you get money from anything else, we're going to claw it back from what we owe you. So the fear was this was just going to be a boondoggle for the private insurers, that they would all of a sudden have this windfall where they didn't have to pay out. And that obviously is not the intention of the benefit, and the minister was very, very clear about that. And so they've talked about language there. Last, to your point, in terms of what do you do when there is this division constitutionally between the provinces that are in charge of a social program, but the feds are seeing a national emergency, a national crisis, and want to assist? How can that work? And it's worked. It's worked before. It worked with $10 a day daycare, where there are provincial federal agreements that get entered into across the country. The Supreme Court has ruled that there are opportunities to be able to have buckets of jurisdictional buckets where both can cooperate in one area. And so the framework is there from the Supreme Court. What we need most, and so if you think about, okay, what's going to keep you up at night? It's making sure that the regulations, that the amount of money, that the how the Canada disability benefit gets rolled out across the country, those regulations are going to be critical. It's going to take a year to develop those. And that's where we need all Canadians to say, this is the opportunity to support millions of Canadians who cannot get income from employment.
So, and you're talking about it being a framework. I haven't seen any numbers attached to this. Is that sort of in the weeds and to be worked out as the legislation becomes more better defined after the fact, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it purely is a framework. It basically says, we, the federal government, want to set up a Canada Disability Benefit, and we're going to co-create it with people with lived experience. We're going to co-create it with people with who are on disability, and we'll tell you about what the amount of money should be down the road. We will tell you how access is granted, whether it's access because here's a sort of a quick aside that's, I think, relevant. When you file your taxes with CRA and you tell CRA, I get money from disability, there is actually no sort of exchange of information. If you you would think that if the federal government in one department knows that you get money from disability, they would automatically enroll you in this benefit plan. But that's not the way that CRA works. CRA holds onto that information tight and does not share it with other departments. And so The hope is that they become a little more nimble in being able to do that, so that the benefit can be an automatic one. If you're on disability in Ontario, the feds know that and therefore can provide you the top up. It actually, maybe we should have probably backed up and said, if you're on disability in Ontario, you get $1,200 a month to survive on. The poverty line is $2,100. Nobody in the province, in any province across the country, ever is doing well when they are dependent on disability. They are underwater every single month. You know, that adage, just sitting at home eating bonbons on a couch, playing video games on disability, that does not happen. And I think we got to dispel that myth uniformly.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the ODSP here in Ontario specifically. And, when you look at whether or not the federal benefit works in conjunction with it, it allows them to top that up to a certain degree. It sounds to me like there will be specific numbers attached to each province because their provincial programs are all different. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, so they're going to have to enter into individual agreements. And I think what you want to make sure is within those agreements that the provinces start to adjust their disability benefit to inflation at least, so that as there are changes to what the poverty line is, that there are changes automatically, and that you're not offloading it from one government to the other, and they're pointing fingers at one another saying, no, you need to increase the payment or not. Down the road, as governments change, you're going to need to stabilize that. Here's kind of like an interesting fact. If you're disabled and on disability, you're within you're underneath the poverty line. As soon as you turn 65, the federal guaranteed income supplement comes in, and suddenly the poverty rate drops by more than half as soon as you turn 65. So what we say is, if you're 20 to 65 and on disability, can't work, we're going to make sure you're in deep poverty. And then when you magically turn 65, we care much more about you, and we will provide you a guaranteed income supplement. And that has never I can never square that rationalization.
Yeah, well, and there's that sort of that adult working age adults are left out of the system so often. We worry about kids under 18 and then those who are seniors over 65. There's a huge cohort in there that we're just not paying attention to in a realistic way. So, I mean, does this disability benefit address some of that or any of that?
It sure does for people on
disability,
who cannot
for sure.
get involved. Yeah. So we still don't. It sounds so crass. We still don't care about the people between 18 and 65. But if they're on disability, I do not think we support them in any notion at all. It's an abomination how we treat people on disability. It just does not live up to any sort of sense of Canadian values. And so this is modeled after the guaranteed income supplement, and has the potential to really lift people into a situation where they can at least get by in community, at least get by. Imagine, and for us at the food bank, I have this ever optimistic sense of hope that our lineups will decrease once those who are on disability do not have to rely on food charity to get by. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'm over optimistic, but I'm going to work as hard as I can to make sure this bill goes through.
That from the most optimistic guy on the planet, Neil Hetherington, CEO at Daily Bread. Just before we go, two things. We know you turned down the opportunity to run for mayor. No name on the ballot. And I see you're wearing your Maple Leaf baseball cap. Did you turn the GM's job down? I heard they went to their second choice, Brad Treliving, as opposed to Neil Hetherington in the box.
Yeah, I'm gonna stick with in my lane and on making sure that people's right to food gets realized.
Excellent, Neil. It's always good to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dave. Great to be with you.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.